You just missed the prayer. um, yeah, I just realized I forgot to turn on my microphone. Uh, but blessings to you, anyways. I'll go and trim this later. um, though I've been discovering that trimming large video files on this computer can be an exercise in frustration. There's nothing quite like taking the scissor tool, clicking on the video file where you want it to cut, and then it takes almost 40 seconds or a minute to figure out actually press the button. um, yeah, I think this machine is showing its age. But anyhow, here we are. We're jumping right into Proverbs chapter 18, picking up where we left off with verse 17. The one who states his case first seems right, until the other comes and examines him. The lot puts an end to quarrels and decides between powerful contenders. A brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city, and quarreling is like the bars of a castle. Okay, with this passage, set of Proverbs here. Oops. Helps if I'm in the right window. If I want to change my slides, there we go. We have a warning, in particular two warnings here, with 17 and 19. The first warning is a call to wisdom and discernment. It wants us to be wary of believing the first person you hear. And there's reason for that. And the big reason is that the first person we hear on a topic, we end up with an assumption that they know what they're talking about, that they're correct, that their explanation is the right explanation. But we have nothing to judge that by. As if it's the first time where we've heard somebody on a particular topic, and it doesn't matter the topic. I mean, it could be just something that happened that day, or it could be somebody who is giving, say, an expert testimony on various topics. Well, if they're the only thing you've heard, you don't have anything to judge what they say against. And so if we are putting the best construction on everything, we are going to assume that they're telling us rightly. But we need to be careful about that because that can be misleading. That would be, say, along the lines of what people would think of as Christian if, say, their first exposure to a Christian was the Mormon Church, who claims to be Christian. So everything that they would tell the person that this is Christian, they wouldn't have anything to judge by it and say, well, maybe, maybe not. But if they assume that it's true, they're going to be misled. Pardon me. Because, well, Mormons, for all that they claim that they're Christian, are not Christian. I mean, they don't believe that Jesus is the Jesus in the Bible. That he is something else. In the big difference, for those of you who are not familiar with official Mormon teaching and with historic Christianity, is twofold, maybe more than twofold. But it's along the lines of that Jesus was a man who became God. Also, that he is not so much the offspring of a virgin birth. According to Mormon theology, God the Father has a body himself, and he used said body to get Mary pregnant. We'll just kind of leave it there. where with historic Christianity, the conception of Jesus was a miraculous conception, um, one that did not involve a physical relationship or contact. And Jesus was God from the beginning. In fact, what happened is it was God taking on human nature, not man becoming God. But a person who is not familiar with Christianity, and if the first person they ever heard about the idea of Christianity was a Mormon, they wouldn't have any way to acknowledge that difference. And this just simply highlights that we need to be careful. Assume the best construction on what the person is telling you, but also be aware that what they may say it may not actually be right. It's interesting and how this plays out in our world, and I don't know if you've ever noticed how people react to various controversies. We'll put it like that. By and notice if there was a correlation between who they were more likely to hear first about the controversy and how they reacted to it. I can think back to one of the big controversies of my growing up, the OJ trial. You could almost tell how people were going to react, whether or not he was guilty or not guilty, by who they were most likely to have heard first, or what kind of background they came from. That also came into it. To a more modern more contemporary example, we could take the recent controversy surrounding a megachurch pastor. You can almost tell how somebody's going to react by who they heard it first from. The guy's congregation, they're defending him in this controversy. People who heard it from elsewhere, they're not, or at least not so much. Again, as far as it goes, I only have loose knowledge, not loose knowledge, only general knowledge on the topic, and it's mostly because I'm distancing myself from the conversation because I don't need to know the lurid details of what somebody else did that doesn't affect me. This is something I think that is between him, his congregation, and God. But anyhow, so I've mostly kept hands off there. But at the same time, we need to approach everything in light of this warning here. So be discerning. And it's also interesting that there's a flip side to this, in that when somebody's cross-examined, suddenly what sounded true no longer sounds true, even when it is true. It's amazing how things can get twisted in the interpretation and the restatement. I can go back to how some people will present different parts of the Bible that are, well, hard sounding to our contemporary ears. They will state it in one way, and it just sounds absolutely horrid. Why would anybody ever want to say anything like that? But when you go back and you look at it, it didn't really say what they made it sound like it was saying. So it's just a simple call to discernment. And at the same time, we've got the warning about a brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city. Boy, are those words true. Once offense is caused, everything that is said afterwards is going to be filtered through that offense. And that causes, well, people to balk, to not budge, to, well, be defensive. To borrow from the illustration of the proverb, I'm more unyielding than a strong city. Recall that a strong city back in the days that Solomon was writing was going to have big, thick walls. And we're not talking, oh, they got like about 12-inch walls. No, we're talking feet, yards, meters of wall. You weren't breaking those down very easily. So it kind of says something that the walls of Jerusalem or the walls of Jericho were torn down. When you consider those were big enough that people could walk across, walk along them at the top, and in fact, in Jericho, people lived in the wall. So yeah, a fence can create an impregnable or a very hard to break into fortress. Something for us to be aware of as Christians is a fence can be a very powerful tool for Satan. It's a way of forming a wall so that the word of God is never heard. A case in point is our outrage culture that seems to be
people want to be outraged.
Yeah, it's not. I don't know so much they want to be outraged, though there are a few people who do seem to carry themselves that way. It's that everything is now being filtered in a certain way that it causes outrage. And so every move of the church now is being filtered through those filters, and it just creates more outrage. You see it to some extent with people's reactions to how the church is handling certain controversies. I go back to the one with the megachurch pastor, and that people are willing to forgive the offense, and people are writing about how that willingness to forgive the offense is harming the victims, and that they would do such a thing that would cause harm to another is outrageous. And never mind the fact that within the church, the thing that we are supposed to do is when the sinner repents is to forgive. Even if the sinner in question did something we as a society see as absolutely horrible. So even something along the line, even forgiveness is being seen as a sign of outrage, and this is what offense can do. Offense was given in this instance, and everything's now being filtered through that. That said, I probably ought to clarify something that, just to make sure that people aren't making a wrong assumption about me, because that occurred while the person was serving as a member of the clergy, I do not think he should continue being a part of the clergy. I think he should be forgiven in light of his repentance, but as somebody who acted in a said fashion, they can no longer be considered above reproach. And honestly, in many ways, their continued staying as a member of the clergy harms the word of other clergy. So that's I just want to clarify that point, because I know that's some people will have that as a question. Well, if you're saying he should be forgiven, that means he should be allowed to say pastor, and it's like no. And it's not just because he's not in my circles. And we're definitely different, a different breed theologically speaking, because I'll say the same thing about a few guys who are calling themselves pastor within my own circles, and have similar kind of allegations. So, but anyhow, enough of that. Let's get back to Proverbs. And from the man's mouth, his stomach is satisfied. He is satisfied by the yield of his lips. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. The poor use entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. A man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Yes, I put all these proverbs on 2 different slides, and part of it was I've been following the breakdown that Dr. Steinman has in his commentary, and when it came right down to it, Proverbs 20 and 21 here, they're pretty close to what we've already heard before, and I didn't feel like belaboring the point on those proverbs, especially because I would like for us to get moving on. I did say I was going to take a more general overview of the Proverbs at the beginning, and so far I've not done that. And really, they do. They reiterate the power of words. So that's where they're at. And when we get into Proverbs 22-24, what we're getting into is something along the lines of the value of good companionship. And so it's communicating this idea that good companionship is to be valued. So we have something along the lines of, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. Having a wife is supposed to be a good thing. I say supposed to because we live in the sinful world, and that means husbands and wives are sinful people, and so that relationship doesn't always work out in a way that we would say is good. But the general idea, the general intention of God was that to have a wife was to be a good thing. Man was not meant to be alone. Man was alone, so God made him a wife. And he said it was good. When God says something is good, it's good. And it is a blessing to have a good wife. We hear a bit more of that in Proverbs 31 when it describes the good wife or the good woman. But here it's emphasizing the value of good companionship. Maybe you've heard people talking about how so and so was hanging out with a bad crowd. In particular, an explanation for why they themselves fell. Who we surround ourselves with. And so we as Christians, we as people in general, want to take care that we are surrounding ourselves with good people. And by good people, I mean people who are going to be good for us to be around. Not just people who make us happy. Because sometimes the person who's good for you to be around is the person who's going to tell you to your face, you're an idiot. In some ways, that could be a sign of a good friend. Now that said, I know that that viewpoint is a little ripe for abuse. I do want to say that they're when they tell you you're being an idiot, they actually do honestly mean it for the best for you, and that they're trying to warn you you're starting to do something stupid. Don't do something stupid. Um, it's almost like hearing your wife in response to an idea that you had on going to do when she says, "Well, you go do whatever you want." Man, if your wife ever says that to you, don't do what you wanted to go do. Because that's a way of saying, yeah, that is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. But I don't think I can stop you. um, but still, the value of a good companion is measurable. Um, and that tends to show a bit more in times of trouble. And that's where what we hit with in verse 24. One of the things that I've heard from people in recovery is that they would talk about when they started to get clean, they friends are. And because what happens is they have, when they've got their drugs, when they've got the good stuff with them, all their druggy friends want to be with them. Because, well, they want to be where the drugs are. When they would go clean, all of those people would suddenly disappear. Or they would be the ones who were trying to pull them back in. And the people who would succeed at any amount of time being clean would say the ones, their real friends were the ones them as they were getting clean and were encouraging them in the getting clean and staying clean. And were even sometimes the ones holding their feet to the fire to make sure that they were doing what they needed to do, including taking them to meetings. And so when we hear there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother, that's what they're talking about. We're talking about the friend who sticks around in adversity. Oops, I keep hitting my button there. So, all right.
Sometimes you have to hang around with some bad people to get the gospel out too.
Yeah, somebody was pointing out, sometimes you gotta hang around the bad people to get the gospel out too. That is true. And this is where we start talking about boundaries, really. You're gonna have a different set of boundaries when you're around people you know you can't really trust than you are when you're going to be around people that you should be able to trust. You're good companions, basically. So this isn't separating yourself from, the evil people from the other side of the tracks. This is simply a way of acknowledging you should value the good companions you have and see them as that's a source of help, as opposed to, say, the people who would not make good companions, at least at the stage that they're at in currently, which isn't to say they couldn't become good companions. I mean, some of the best people I know now are former addicts, so when they were in the height of their addiction, I wouldn't trust them with a ham sandwich. But now that they're in recovery, I trust them more. All right, and Proverb 23. The poor use entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. Well, we only have to turn on the evening news to see how that works out.
That's true.
Verse 23, that's something of a warning against partiality. To some extent, when it speaks of roughly here, it's the idea of extreme confidence. Oops. I erased my E. It's the idea that they are so confident in their position because of their power that they can say anything they want in any way they want. While the poor are going to speak from weakness. Oops. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that this doesn't necessarily mean financial wealth or financial lack of wealth. Because you can find people who are dirt poor but will answer with extreme confidence or roughly, as it puts it here in the proverb. And you can find people who are exceptionally wealthy who speak in a way that we would associate with weakness, or from a weak position. So some of this is referring to, well, faith and pride.
Maybe something like we're talking with confidence opposed to lack of confidence.
So the question is, are we somebody
Talking
talking with
with
confidence
confidence,
or lack of confidence? Yeah, to some extent. I would also I would lean it towards that their words are maybe a bit more of a plea and a demand. But with this particular passage, I want to say, in the context that it falls in, where we go back to the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him, is that it is something of a warning against partiality by how people are presenting themselves. And it's doing so with the contrast of poor and rich, to highlight the one you're going to look down upon and the one you are going to look up to. We're more likely to look up to the one who's rich.
They have more power.
Because they have more power. They have the external look of having it together, of being a good person.
That's not always the case, though.
Which is true. And like I said earlier, we don't have to look further than the evening news. At the same time, we have a tendency to look down upon those who have the external appearance of not having it together. Sociological studies have been performed along these lines. In fact, there was even a TV show. I never really watched it. It was Undercover Boss, where they basically, it was a sociological experiment. I mean, how would people react to their boss if their boss looked like them? and vice versa. I can remember this one girl talking about a guy who would show up at her dad's accounting office. Her dad was a CPA. And the guy would come in, he was a client, and he would also use their copier because they would rent out their copier, and they were in a small town area. And she said, this guy looked like a farmhand. He'd come in old tattered jeans, beat up shirt, a rather worn cowboy hat, and dirty cowboy boots. This was Texas, by the way, out in farm country. So, if he's sounding like somebody who came straight out of there, there's a reason. And this guy was the richest guy in the area. And he was worth millions. And it wasn't just land wealth either. And this guy was an incredibly wealthy man. But he looked like one of the farm hands. Or ranch hands, excuse me, because it was actually his cattle ranching area.
Kind of like Sam Walton in his day.
Yeah, kind of like Sam Walton in his day. Yeah, not everybody is going to be dressed to the nines. And similarly, they with as I mentioned, the sociological studies, they've noticed that your better performing salespeople tend to be the ones who dress very professionally. The ones who basically look good in a suit is what it comes down to. Where a salesperson who's dressed like me, they probably, they wouldn't have high regard, but they wouldn't have low regard.
Remember that book, Dress for Success?
Yeah, the book Dress for Success, or the phrase "dress for the job you want." Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that one. There was a great joke that goes along those lines. And he said, "My boss told me to dress for the job that I want. Now I'm sitting at a disciplinary meeting wearing my Batman costume."
Oh boy! Or my boss said, "Have a good day," so I went home.
Yeah. But again, this collection of Proverbs, some of it just boils down to don't judge a book by its cover, be discerning, be careful of partiality. And on that note, we're going to wrap up because I am now 5 minutes over. And so I will wish you all a good week, blessings, and I hope to see you all again next week. And I just